Welcome to the July 2016 episode of This Week in Germany. It's 100 years since the Battle of the Somme started, one of the bloodiest battles in history. But is Germany doing enough to remember the First World War? Also, now that Britain is leaving the EU, what impact will Brexit have on Germany? Plus, we talk Bauhaus, the aesthetic movement that draws in design students from around the world. All that, plus your news in brief, coming up. Okay, so let's get started with episode 107. It's been quite a tumultuous week for Europe after Britain voted to leave the European Union. The country has been one of Germany's closest partners in the EU, so what does a Brexit mean for Germany and the Union as a whole? Joining me to talk about that now is Olkan Hiller. Hello, Olkan.
Hi, Daniel. How are you?
I am extremely depressed about this whole Brexit thing, being a British person living in the EU. So I'm not very happy. But maybe you could sum up what happened and the reaction, especially the reaction from Germany.
Yeah, so the results came out on the 22nd. A lot of the polls beforehand had really sort of pointed that Remain was going to edge it past and was going to win. So when it came out that the Leave campaign had actually won on the morning of the 22nd, a lot of people were quite shocked. They did win by about a percentage point or two. It was 51.9% for Leave and 48.1% for Remain. So it was about the difference of about 1.5 million people. It was shocking for the UK, but that also spread across Europe as well, because as I said, everybody was expecting the Remain side to win. Germany's reaction was interesting in the fact that they were one of the few countries that sort of asked for calm and to wait and see what happens, whereas other countries like France were sort of asking for the process to be started straight away. Especially with the resignation of David Cameron, this has sort of put a lot more uncertainty into the situation, and Germany, I think, is one of the few countries that's sort of asking for a bit more level-headed thinking about what to do next.
Well, many people said that the UK should just sign Article 50, which triggers the UK leaving the EU, straight away in order to remove uncertainty. But it was Angela Merkel, the head of the German government, who basically said, no, let's take things slowly. And that's clever politics, because if Article 50 isn't signed, nothing happens. And there could be a general election in the UK with a pro-EU party winning, which could lead to the UK staying in the EU. So clever politics on the part of Angela Merkel there when it comes to Remain.
There is the point that in Section 50 within this Lisbon Treaty, there is no get-out clause. Once you say we're going, you cannot backtrack, you cannot cancel it. So it is a very ultimate decision that once you make it, you have to stick with it.
That's right. And then you can rejoin, it says in the Article 50, but that would be years and years and years. So it is a fairly permanent thing. So when the Brexit happens, if it really does come to that, which it seems quite possible, does this mean we're going to see Germany isolated in the EU? After all, Britain and Germany have got along quite well in those terms.
The UK and Germany always sort of saw themselves as allies, and they sort of backed each other up in situations in the past where if a decision was to come that the UK would support Germany or vice versa. So definitely Germany will see itself a lot more isolated in regards to decision making within the EU. They're somewhat isolated, while still Germany, I think, still is in a somewhat of a power role, but still maybe reduced to a certain extent.
Okay, and what about when it comes to trade? Is Germany going to be poorer because of this?
I would say that it's going to have somewhat of an impact, definitely. How much at this point, it's really hard to tell. But German exports to the UK, for example, total at 100 billion euros. So that's a lot of exports going to the UK that will now have difficulty to get there due to the whole free trade agreement that can be cancelled out. We don't know what will happen. But
yeah, we don't know what will happen. It entirely depends on what kind of model the UK leaves with. It could be that there's still a connection with the EU where they have to pay into it and they have to allow the free movement of people in order to access the single market. That's the Norway model, let's call it. But it could also be that the UK really does crash out of the EU entirely and tariffs are set up. That's going to make trade between the UK and Germany more expensive and therefore more difficult. So the success of the UK-Germany trade relationship entirely depends on what kind of EU exit the UK has.
Right, I think that's actually the biggest problem right now is this uncertainty. And this is what is having an effect on the markets all over Europe, is that nobody knows what's going to happen. And this is what's making everybody a lot more worried.
Right, and Germany sells a big chunk of its cars to the UK. And this came up in one of the debates where the head of the Leave campaign, Boris Johnson, he said that there's no way that Germany would set up tariffs with the UK, so that taxing imports and exports between the two countries, because it's such an important area for Germany to make money from. But this is the thing, is that the UK wouldn't be negotiating a trade deal with Germany. It would be with the whole of the EU. And so Germany doesn't get a very specific say that we want our car industry to do well, because there are other countries which have to be factored in here. Other countries might want to outdo German industry by imposing tariffs, so it's complicated. And how have the big decision makers in Germany reacted to the Brexit decision?
Well, I mean, one of the major reactions was actually from Angela Merkel on Saturday when she had this news conference responding to the results, where she sort of went into how people should react to it, and she reacted in this clip.
Okay, let's take a listen.
Es gibt nichts drum herum zu reden.
There's no way of talking around it. Today was a turning point for Europe and for the European unifying process. The consequences will depend on whether we are willing and capable of analysing the situation quietly and calmly, and on this basis take the right decisions together.
Und auf dieser Grundlage gemeinsam die richtigen Entscheidungen zu treffen.
So a call for calm and sobriety from Angela Merkel there. But Olkan, what have the normal, everyday Germans had to say about this?
I mean, it's quite interesting. I'm Irish, so I mean, in theory, it shouldn't affect me. It may affect Ireland in times to come. But even still, talking to people on the street, when they hear I'm from Ireland, they bring up Brexit. It's definitely on everybody's mind right now. And I think it's something that, while they may not be worried about it right now, there is this air of uncertainty, I think, brings a little bit of worry to everybody, no matter if they're in Germany or in France or in Ireland or in the UK.
All right, uncertain times ahead. Olkan, you're lucky to be Irish in this moment. You
really
would
am.
not want to be British right now.
The luck of the Irish.
Yes. So thanks for coming to the studio and explaining that for us.
Thank you very much.
Now it's time for this month's news in brief. New rules to curb spying by Germany's foreign intelligence agency, called the Bundesnachrichtendienst, have been accepted by the government. The BND will be overseen by an independent regulator. Economic espionage is banned, but spying on the country's allies and EU neighbours is not, in cases which are of importance to national security. The measures still need to be approved by Germany's parliament. Staying with the Bundestag, the parliament has banned fracking. The method for releasing oil and gas underground is controversial, with some saying it has an environmental impact. Until now, the practice was largely unregulated. A man was shot dead by police in the state of Hesse after taking over a dozen hostages in a cinema. The hostages were injured by the CS gas used by police to drive out the suspect, but none of them were killed. A guard at the Nazi death camp Auschwitz was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The 94-year-old was convicted with accessory to the murder of 170,000 people. And finally, the town of Minden in North Rhine-Westphalia has hailed a refugee as a hero after he handed in 150,000 euros in cash and savings books to authorities. He discovered the money inside a cupboard which was donated to him by a charity. The 25-year-old man came to Germany from Syria in October. Now it's time for this month's main feature. July the 1st is the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. It was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, pitting the German Empire against Britain and France. Over the course of the war, up to 2 million Germans died. Yet there seems to be a remarkable lack of public recognition of the war. Most of Germany's attention is focused on education and commemoration around the Second World War. On Twitter, over half of you told us Germany isn't doing enough to remember the First World War, so we decided to ask an expert. On the line now is Gerhard Hirschfeld, Professor of Modern History at the University of Stuttgart. He was also Director of the Library of Contemporary History, one of the world's most renowned research centres. So, Professor Hirschfeld, what significance does the Somme have in World War I and also in a wider historical context?
One should, of course, realize that the Battle of the Somme took place in 1916. And this year was a very decisive year. It has been the year of the big battles, Verdun, the Somme, and then battles in Galicia and Russia, so on the Eastern Front. 1916 is a very important year as far as the First World War is concerned. What the Battle of the Somme made now shows the total war as it now unfolded. The totality can be seen by the use of weaponry. For instance, the more than 2 or 3 million artillery shells being used during this battle. The second criteria for calling the Battle of the Somme a total battle and part of the total war is the use of the airplane. Airplanes were not just used for reconnaissance, but also took an active part in the fighting. And thirdly, it is the use of gas and other weapons which were so destructive that they became now a normal experience of soldiers' life. This, of course, led to the enormous losses. While Verdun, on the whole, suffered losses of up to 700,000 soldiers. The Battle of the Somme was more than 1.1 million casualties altogether. And it was also a global battle in the respect that more than 20 nations took part in this battle. So you see, the globality, the enormity of mass destruction, and the way soldiers suffered in this battle is a sign, it's a menetekel, as one should say, the writing on the wall of the total war.
Now, you mentioned there the Battle of Verdun, which ran at the same time as the Battle of the Somme, but it was much longer, running from February to December of 1916, one of the longest and costliest battles of human history. How did these two huge battles differ?
Verdun was, in short, a battle between the French and the Germans, and it was limited in one space, while the Battle of the Somme, which took place 3 months later, or started 3 months later, was, of course, a real global battle. That means more than 20 nations took part in this battle, and it became an uncontrolled battle. While Verdun still remained under the control of 2 nations, now at the Battle of the Somme, 3 nations were involved, and of course, on all sides, soldiers from so many different countries. So one call it a real global battle.
And how did the Germans of the time feel about the First World War as all of these huge battles are going on and sapping resources from the country? It must have been incredibly tough to keep up morale.
Well, those battles came as a surprise to the German public, to the German home front. Battle of the Verdun was regarded as a battle of sacrifice and a battle of, in a way, an unnecessary battle, because it was nothing came out of it. While the battle at the Somme was hailed, at least at the time, as a glorious act of defense, even that the front didn't move more than 10 kilometers towards the east. Of course, we don't have opinion polls being taken at the time, and we don't have regular questionnaires being put to German households. But what we know from soldiers' letters, from letters sent to the front by the families, is that increasingly Germans suffered under the impact of the war. Up to 1916, the war was seen as happening outside German borders, except from one invasion in 1914, when the Russians invaded Eastern Prussia. There were no foreign soldier on German territory. The Germans were well advanced, 300 kilometers to the west, 300 to 400 kilometers to the east. So the war was far removed from the average German, insofar that there was no active fighting. But of course, the war had left an impact. The scarcity of food. We all know these pictures of women queuing up in front of the shops for bread and for vegetables. We all have seen children begging in the streets. That, of course, is more after 1916, but it started already during this year. So the war was felt for the first time, and it was the mass killings which left an impact. It was the scarcity of food, and it was a general destruction of the German society as such. And in addition, this situation was aggravated by the Allied blockade of the German ports. So German ships were not able to cross the blockade, so no imports were guaranteed, only from some neutral countries, but otherwise it was the year of extreme suffering, and this suffering then prolonged. So the battles, Verdun and the Somme, were seen as a possibility to overcome this stalemate and this suffering, and in a way should then be on the first jump to the final victory, which all the generals had predicted for that year.
Okay, and fast forward now to the Germany of today. Are Germans doing enough to educate themselves and to commemorate the First World War?
For many, many years, the First World War was very much under the shadow of the Second World War. The Second World War was always seen as the war that was so decisive. It was the enormity of the war, the casualties, it was the Shoah, the killing of Jews, which all left an impact on German post-war society after the Second World War. And so the First World War seemed to have disappeared for many years in the shadow. By the way, this is not a German phenomenon. We had the same in Russia, in other countries in Europe who tended to regard the Second World War as the most decisive war, unlike Britain and France and Belgium, perhaps, where the First War always was the Great War, the glorious war. Now, this has changed, and it has changed in the last 2-3 years for a number of reasons. First of all, there is a growing interest into the history of the First World War, an interest that sprang up from books, television programs, exhibitions, from teaching at the schools that changed in the last years. And there's also a second observation, and this is the interest in family history. What we have experienced in 2014 was a personal interest by people to find out about their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, about their families at the time. How did they experience the war? So what was their suffering? What remained in the attics? What was still kept in the families? So this added up to an interest which up to then was not experienced in Germany. So it met a scholarly interest and at the same time a personal interest in the war.
Okay, and I'd like to touch on one last point before we wrap up, and that's something by the historian Neil MacGregor. Now, he wrote a book on German history, and saying that there's no other capital in the world which gives up so much of its space right in the middle of its city centre to commemorate national shame. And he is talking, of course, about the memorials of the Second World War, which seek to warn future generations of what happened there. But why is it important that we also remember the First World War in Germany?
Apart from the number of casualties, this is the answer always given, that the war demanded so many casualties. And in most of the societies at the time, in all societies, I would say, these sacrifices were seen as in vain. Before 1914, there was a feeling among the European societies that war was not a possibility, that war should not take place. In fact, when the World Exhibition of 1900 in Paris took place, people expected that this was the start of a glorious 100th century of peace. The Hague Peace Conferences, all the feeling that peace would rule were so strongly felt. Now, this changed within weeks. And the question, of course, being asked, why was it possible that European societies, not always peace-minded, but at least who had taken a rather restricted view of war, were prepared to go to war? Why this hatred within a relatively short period? Why this irrationality? And of course, we go through difficult times at the moment. We just had the result of the referendum in Britain. Of course, it's always problematic to link historical events happening 100 years ago with political events of our time. But I was puzzled by the way that normal rational arguments somehow disappeared in a relatively short time, and people were, let's say, voting with their stomachs, were simply sort of seeing as rather naive and rather limited, reflected positions as acceptable. And they felt, again, things like fear, like anxieties should dictate political decision. And this, of course, is in a way a frightening aspect of our time. And then if you link those perceptions with the fears and anxieties of the populations 100 years ago, you might perhaps easier understand, perhaps not fully comprehend, but easier understand why people supported the respective the politician at the time and their decisions to go to war. I'm not saying these are historical parallels. What I'm saying is that the attitude of people, that their basic feelings are have little changed since then, and we still take decisions in such an uncontrolled and unreflected way that point to some similarities.
Okay, Gerhard Hirschfeld, thank you very much for talking to us here on This Week in Germany. If you want to read more from Professor Hirschfeld, his book on the Somme has just been re-released in German, in an updated version. It's called Die Deutschen an der Somme, Krieg, Besatzung und verbrannte Erde. You can find the link to it on our show notes for this episode. Now, if you're enjoying everything we're doing on This Week in Germany, please don't forget to donate. For the price of one beer, that's only, on average, €3.89 or just over $4 here, you can send us a monthly donation to keep this podcast going. Just head to thisweekingermany.de/beermoney and help us stay afloat. All our episodes are provided free for everyone, and so if you can afford it for the price of just one beer a month, we'll keep bringing you the top stories from Germany in English, decoding German culture, society and politics. thisweekingermany.de/beermoney. Thank you for your support. Now it's time to visit a cool location in this very country. It's time for Destination Germany. So now it's time for Destination Germany, where we take you on a trip to the best places to visit in the country. This month we're heading to Saxony-Anhalt. Now this is a state which isn't known for being a tourism hotspot, but if you're into design, the city of Dessau is the place to be. That's because it's the home of Bauhaus, the design movement that encompasses everything from buildings to furniture. The original staatliches Bauhaus, as it was known, was set up in Weimar in 1919, eventually moving to Dessau and then Berlin. In its time, and even today, the aesthetic of the school was hugely influential. These days, the place to go and experience the movement is Dessau, as the complex of buildings here were restored and modernized after the war, with the area now belonging to the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites. So we decided to ask someone to tell us about the full Bauhaus experience in Dessau.
So it's me, Helga Huskamp. I'm the press officer of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation.
Following the First World War, many designers saw the need to break with the past, to make a change in the aesthetic of buildings and everyday objects. This drive and desire to make design more modern was what kicked off the Bauhaus movement.
Modern in a sense of industrialization, modern in a sense of being open-minded, modern in a sense also of scientific, that scientific, like psychology aspects became more important. And Dessau was really an impulsive city of industrialization at that time. And they really asked the Bauhaus to come to Dessau. They spent a lot of money, as the city itself spent a lot of money to finance this Bauhaus architecture.
Now, Dessau has a mishmash of architectural styles. That's because it was bombed during the Second World War and rebuilt in the typical East German style of these flat-pack buildings which are assembled on site, these Plattenbaugebäude. Also, if you take a look at the marketplace, that area is really traditional style, and then you cross the train tracks and get to the Bauhaus district itself. It's a very strange other world of architecture.
The communists started to make a prototype of a socialist city of Dessau. So if you come today, it's a little bit like a historical architecture map. So it's really for people being interested in architecture, it's really an interesting town to go or city to see, because you really can see these historical periods. Bauhaus has been a place of modernism and internationalism. So it was part of the town on the one hand side, but on the other hand side, it was always a little bit separated, because a normal German town is more conservative. But if you come to Dessau, still today, it's the town in Germany where you have the most Bauhaus architecture, and we have a lot of architecture that is lean on the Bauhaus idea, that have been, for example, students on the Bauhaus, and they have been in charge to do houses here in Dessau.
The thing you notice when you visit the Bauhaus district in Dessau is that all the buildings look like they could have been built yesterday, which is a testament to this style which originated 100 years ago.
To sit in this building, really, it's each day, it's fascinating. It's you not really have to search for connection between the historical and the 21st century. Even to sit in this architecture, who is now about 90 years old, it doesn't seem to be historical. It's unbelievable. It's something special.
So if you decide to visit the place for yourself, what can you experience there as a tourist, as a visitor?
We are part of the UNESCO World Heritage, and you can come and see the Bauhaus as its architecture. You can doing a guided tour, and you will be explained all about this Bauhaus, what was happened here in the 20s. You can also sleep at the Bauhaus, and it's a nice atmosphere to stay for at least one night, to have this Bauhaus atmosphere also at the night. At the Preller House, that was a student house in the 1920s, and you stay in the students' apartments.
So that's the Bauhaus district in Dessau, a mix of tourist hotspot for those fascinated by design and an active university campus for architecture students as well. If you want to find out more and see some pictures of this month's destination, then head to our website, thisweekingermany.de. All the details are there in our show notes. Thank you very much to Helga Huskam of the Dessau Bauhaus Foundation for talking to us about this month's destination. And that brings us to the end of yet another episode of This Week in Germany. It's been quite an interesting mixed bag this month, I'd say. Please remember to support us by donating the price of just one beer. That's all, one beer every month for all this amazing, exclusive, special content. Head over to thisweekingermany.de/beer money to give us €3.89 a month. That's a tiny amount, and you'll be massively supporting the efforts of this podcast. That's thisweekingermany.de/beer money. And a big thank you to all of the brand new subscribers that we've received in the last month. It's great to have you on board. Don't forget to check out our Twitter and Facebook pages to stay up to date with all of the latest news in Germany. You can also rate us 5 stars in iTunes. That helps us reach even more people. Thank you to everyone who's done that over the past month. In next month's podcast, we're going to talk about the strange mix in Germany between scientific medicine and alternative medicine. So basically, when you have qualified medical doctors prescribing treatments such as homeopathy and reflexology, have you had any experiences of that? If you'd like, you can contribute to next month's episode by emailing us feedback at thisweekingermany.de. We'd love to hear about your experiences of medicine in Germany, good or bad. This Week in Germany is produced and presented by me, Daniel Winter, with production support from Olken Hiller. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back in just a few weeks with another episode of This Week in Germany.